There are moments in life no one plans for, moments that slip into our days, the way soft rain falls across a quiet city street. No grand announcement, no warning, just gentle presence that slowly rewrites the rhythm of living. For Keanureeves and Sandra Bullock in this fictional world, it began not on a film set, not under blinding stage spotlights or camera flashes, but on an ordinary afternoon inside an airport where hundreds moved like waves without ever knowing how two lives were about to intertwine again in the simplest, most human way. Keanu stood near the boarding gate, hands in pockets, wearing that familiar quiet man patience that the world admired about him. He wasn't surrounded by assistants or photographers. Today, he was just another traveler heading toward the next chapter of life. His leather backpack hung softly from his shoulder, hair slightly windswept as if the world outside had been talking to him. The terminal smelled of coffee, tired plans, and handwritten journeys. People laughed, others hurried. Somewhere a child cried for a toy. It all unfolded like a painting, imperfect but alive. He looked calm, but Keanu was carrying more than luggage. Inside him lived years of solitude, kindness shaped by loss, grief turned into gentleness, and wisdom polished by time. His success never hardened him, it made him softer. He treated strangers with the same respect he would offer kings. He believed in giving quietly, in helping without needing applause, in feeling deeply even when the world expected steel. He didn't know Sandra was in the same airport. She walked through the terminal wearing a white sweater, hair pinned loosely behind her ear, eyes carrying the kind of softness only life experience gives, a mix of strength and vulnerability, joy and heartbreak, hope and memory. She looked like someone who had weathered storms and still chose sunlight. Sandra wasn't running from life. She was walking steadily through it, even when the path was uneven. Her flight had been delayed. Her shoulders held exhaustion, not from work alone, but from emotional miles walked beneath her ribs. The world saw her smile, but few understood the strength it took to keep that smile sincere. Sandra had learned to be strong without sacrificing tenderness. She still sent kindness into rooms even when she herself needed it most. Fate, or something like it, guided her steps. She didn't see Keanu right away. He didn't see her either. Two souls wandering in the same air, inches apart from a gentle shift neither expected. When she finally looked up, her breath paused like a held note in music. Not shock, something gentler, recognition, warmth, a memory that felt like sunlight returning after winter. Keanu felt it too the moment he turned his head. Not dramatic, not explosive, just a quiet awareness like a soft bell ringing inside the heart. He smiled first, slow, steady, respectful. Sandra smiled back, and the distance between them dissolved without movement. Their conversation began the way life often writes its most beautiful chapters. Simple words, soft tone, mutual respect. "Long time," Sandra said, voice calm but touched by nostalgia. "Yeah," Keanu answered with that thoughtful stillness of his. "Too long." No cameras, no scripts, just two humans in an airport sharing air and unspoken history. They didn't rush into excitement. They eased into presence like old friends who understood silence just as well as laughter. They walked together toward the boarding area, not because they planned to, but because conversation opened a door and neither wanted to close it. They spoke about travel, about life's unexpected lessons, about how time changes everything and nothing at all. Sandra talked about gratitude, warmth in her tone. Keanu listened, really listened, the way few people truly know how. And then the announcement came, a shared flight destination neither had known about. Sandra laughed softly. "You're kidding." Keanu blinked with amused surprise, shaking his head. "Looks like the universe booked this trip." There was no fate theory dramatic music, just coincidence or something close to it, gently guiding them forward. Their seats were next to each other, though neither had arranged it. Keanu offered her the window. Sandra insisted he take it. He refused. She insisted again. They laughed like children stuck in polite war. When they finally settled, night began to brush the world outside the plane window, clouds like silver mountains, sky like deep velvet. Sandra leaned back, slow breaths exhaling the tension from her shoulders. Keanu folded his jacket neatly, placed it beside him, eyes soft with that familiar, thoughtful distance. They didn't need constant words, comfort lived quietly between them. The flight lifted, engines humming like a lullaby, and Sandra glanced at Keanu, not with romantic urgency, not with cinematic intensity, but with quiet human affection. An understanding, a peace. And soon, without expecting it, she drifted into sleep. Her head tilted gently, naturally, landing against Keanu's shoulder like a leaf falling onto still water. Not planned, not dramatic, just real, soft, human. For a moment, Keanu froze, not out of discomfort, but reverence. He had lived a life where tenderness was rare and precious. He didn't move, didn't shift away. Instead, he turned slightly, giving her more comfort, letting her rest against him like a trust unspoken. Her breathing fell into rhythm, slow, warm, peaceful against him. His gaze softened, a faint smile touching his face not because he expected anything from her, but because moments like this were rare. Two souls resting without needing anything, without performing, without pretending. He thought about time, how life steals people away, how precious it is when someone feels safe enough to rest beside you. Keanu valued silence not for emptiness, but for meaning. Sandra sleeping against him was not romance, it was trust, gentle and real. The cabin lights dimmed. Outside, distant lightning flickered like silver veins across the night sky. Travelers around them slept, unaware that a quiet story had begun between two hearts without asking permission. Keanu closed his eyes too, not to sleep, but to exist in the moment fully, respectfully, gratefully. If life is a book, some chapters begin with fireworks, others with doors closing. This one began with a shoulder and a heartbeat. He didn't wake her. He simply stayed, present, steady, warm like a horizon someone could walk toward without fear. And in that fragile golden silence, something unspoken formed between them, not love declared, but connection breathed. A beginning. Sandra woke with the softness of dawn, not the noise of arrival. Her eyes blinked open gently, the way flowers open when the world is quiet. Before she even remembered where she was, she felt warmth beneath her cheek, steady, calm, certain. Then she realized. She had fallen asleep on Keanu's shoulder. The thought sent a flutter of apology through her chest, but instead of pulling away instantly, she stayed still for a moment longer, allowing herself to feel the peace that had held her without conditions. Keanu was awake. He hadn't moved the entire time. He glanced down at her as she stirred, not startled, not awkward, just quietly present, carrying a serenity that made her feel safe rather than embarrassed. She lifted her head slowly, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, cheeks warming with self-awareness. In ordinary life, she was poised, graceful, composed. But this moment stripped away performance, leaving only the woman beneath, the woman who still needed softness in a world that demanded strength. She whispered a gentle apology, her voice barely louder than the hum of the engines. Keanu shook his head in that minimal way he often did, the refusal more like kindness than correction. "You were tired," he said softly, not teasing, not dramatic, just understanding. Sometimes the simplest words carry the most healing. Sandra inhaled slowly, grounding herself back into awareness, noticing the way the cabin lights washed the seats in muted gold. The flight attendants moved quietly, like careful guardians of sleep. Outside, dawn was beginning to stretch across the sky, making the world look like a watercolor still drying. Keanu sat relaxed, one arm resting along the edge of the seat, posture open, protective without trying to be. Sandra wondered how long he had stayed like that, letting her rest. It was not romantic tension that filled the air. It was something purer, more human. The kind of warmth rare in an industry built on performance. He didn't ask her why she slept or what tired her. He didn't try to make the moment heavy or light. He simply existed beside her, which somehow meant more. She found herself studying him not as an icon, not as a character audiences adored, but as a man shaped by quiet resilience. The lines near his eyes weren't signs of age. They were proof of life lived deeply. His presence created space, not pressure. She admired that. Without planning it, without needing to, she leaned slightly toward him again, not resting on his shoulder this time, but finding comfort in closeness. They exchanged small, thoughtful smiles. No performance, no expectation, just two people breathing in the same fragile morning. When the plane landed, passengers stirred with the usual chaos, bags rustling, voices rising, impatience filling the aisle. But Keanu and Sandra remained still for a moment longer, like two travelers who understood that rushing through life makes us miss the beauty in it. When they stood, Keanu offered her hand, not dramatically extending it, not waiting for recognition, just naturally as someone who valued gentleness over spectacle. Sandra took it, fingers wrapping around the quiet strength in his palm. Their footsteps matched without trying, a silent rhythm forming between them. Outside the aircraft, the world greeted them with sunlight and noise. Taxi horns, luggage wheels scraping on pavement, airport announcements echoing through vast ceilings. Yet something felt different, like they carried a shared silence back into the sound. They collected their bags side by side, still unhurried, moving through crowds like two calm rivers running parallel. At the exit doors, Sandra paused. She didn't want this moment to dissolve the way travel usually dissolves strangers into separate stories. Keanu paused too, sensing the unspoken hesitation. Sometimes connection doesn't need years, it needs presence. She asked if he was heading somewhere urgent. He was. She wasn't either. Their free hours aligned like constellations. They decided to walk instead of disappear into separate cars. No plan, no schedule, just movement through sunlight. The city streets met them with breeze and brightness, the kind that makes people feel awake in more ways than one. Sandra carried her jacket over her arm, wind lifting her hair softly. Keanu walked with hands inside coat pockets, eyes observing life rather than racing past it. They didn't talk about fame or projects or headlines. They talked about books, about strange airport coffee flavors, about how people chase happiness like a destination when it is often found in ordinary moments like shared footsteps and open morning sky. They reached a small cafe tucked between tall buildings, wooden chairs on the sidewalk, the smell of roasted beans swirling like memory. They sat outside, not hidden but unnoticed, just two travelers stopping for warmth. Sandra wrapped her hands around her mug, absorbing the comfort of heat against skin that had known exhaustion. Keanu stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, listening more than speaking in a world that applauds volume. He was quiet in a way that felt like care. Their conversation dipped into deeper waters without force. Sandra spoke of times she felt lost, not dramatically but honestly. She spoke about holding herself together when life felt heavier than her bones. Keanu didn't interrupt. He didn't try to fix her pain. He understood that sometimes what we need isn't solution, it's witness. He shared his own reflections slowly, like someone placing stones gently into the palm of a friend. He spoke of grief, of the weight of memory, of choosing compassion even when the world hardened around him. He didn't make it a tragedy. He made it a lesson. People walked past them without knowing what was unfolding, two souls exchanging truths like secret letters. No cameras, no script, just reality softened by understanding. Sandra realized she wasn't performing, she wasn't smiling for expectation. She was simply existing, and Keanu was someone who made existence feel enough. When she laughed, it wasn't polished. It was real, unguarded, warm. Keanu's eyes crinkled gently, the kind of smile that doesn't need applause. Hours passed unnoticed. The sun climbed, fell, softened. They spoke about meaning, about purpose, about how kindness can be a form of rebellion in a world addicted to noise. Sandra told him she sometimes felt like she was walking with pieces of herself she hadn't learned to place yet. Keanu told her it was okay, that everyone carries pieces. What matters is how gently we hold them. By the time evening traced gold across building windows, neither of them was ready to part. So they walked again, through parks where leaves whispered like secrets, past street musicians whose notes braided into the wind. Children played, dogs barked joyfully, someone was painting, someone was singing, someone was falling in love without realizing. The world was alive and imperfect and beautiful. Sandra sat with him on a bench beneath swaying branches, the sky turning deep amber above them. She looked at him, not as a co-star, not as a myth, but as a person shaped by softness and courage. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. Today felt like breathing in a way I forgot was possible. Keanu looked at her with that steady gaze of his, the one that made silence feel like dialogue. Me too, he said simply. Sometimes profound truth fits into very few words. There was no confession. No sudden romantic spark, just something beginning quiet, patient, respectful. A connection not rushed by desire nor diluted by fear, something built from presence rather than expectation. When they finally rose from the bench, the streetlights had started to glow. Sandra pulled her sweater closer around her shoulders. Keanu offered his scarf without hesitation. She accepted. That scarf wrapped around her wasn't love yet, it was care, it was empathy. It was the kind of gesture that lingers in memory longer than grand declarations. Before they separated, they didn't promise anything. They didn't exchange dramatic vows or scripted words. Instead, they shared one long look, steady, warm understanding. A moment that said, whatever this is, it matters. A moment that whispered, this story isn't finished yet. Sometimes the most powerful beginnings are the gentle ones. Sometimes connection arrives not with fire, but with warmth that teaches us to rest, to breathe, to trust again. Keanu and Sandra walked away in different directions, but not apart. Something remained between them, alive, unspoken, unfolding slowly like dawn across a sleeping sky. And deep inside both of them, something whispered softly. This journey isn't coincidence. It is the beginning of something that will change everything. Days passed, and though their lives returned to separate routines, neither Sandra nor Keanu felt distant from the memory of that day. It lingered like perfume on fabric, subtle, warm, impossible to ignore. Sandra found herself replaying small moments, the way his eyes softened when he listened, how he never rushed her thoughts, how he offered silence not as emptiness but as understanding. Meanwhile, Keanu would think of her laughter during quiet evenings at home, not the polished smile cameras captured, but the raw, unguarded sound she released over coffee when life felt briefly gentle. They had not promised to meet again, and yet something inside each of them moved like a tide, pulling inward, returning outward, waiting. Then one unexpectedly simple message arrived. Sandra woke to a quiet morning, a shaft of sunlight cutting across her kitchen counter. Her phone buzzed with a number she recognized even though she had not seen it in years. She hesitated, not from uncertainty but from awareness her heart knew even before her mind processed it. When she opened the message, it was brief, written in the same thoughtful cadence Keanu spoke with. Coffee again sometime. Not a demand, not an assumption, just an opening, small, respectful, genuine. She stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because she didn't know her answer, but because the simplicity of the invitation carried meaning deeper than words. After a slow breath, she replied with something just as gentle. "I'd like that." No emojis, no exclamation marks. Honesty does not need decoration. Their second meeting wasn't grand or glamorous. They chose a bookstore cafe tucked between city buildings where pages smelled like old dreams and roasted beans. Sandra arrived first, fingers tracing the spines of travel memoirs while her heart waited for footsteps she somehow already recognized. When Keanu walked in, he carried the same quiet calm that seemed almost to bend the air around him. He wasn't late, he wasn't early, he was simply present in a way that made time soften. They sat together among shelves, sharing coffee again, but this time conversation flowed like a river that had already carved its path into the earth. They spoke about movies only lightly. Instead, they drifted into deeper spaces. Childhood memories, strangers who changed them, places that felt like healing. Sandra confessed that she sometimes feared quiet because it brought thoughts she didn't always want to meet. Keanu told her he embraced quiet because it allowed him to listen to the things he tried not to forget. Their reflections were different, but they fit, two puzzle pieces carved by separate storms, now finding alignment. They began walking afterward, not out of plan but instinct. The afternoon sun filtered through branches above them as they moved through a small botanical garden, where white petals fell like slow snow. Sandra paused at a fountain, listening to water that mirrored her own rhythm, steady yet emotional. Keanu sat with her on a nearby bench, elbows resting lightly on his knees, gaze soft but attentive. They didn't force conversation, silence settled between them like a blanket rather than a wall. Then Sandra spoke, voice low, vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed publicly. She shared a memory of losing someone she cared deeply about, a grief she had carried like a hidden thread through years of work and fame. Keanu listened, and when she finished, he didn't offer platitudes or solutions. He shared his own scars gently, not to overshadow hers, but to walk beside them. He spoke of love lost to time, of absence that shaped him into someone who cherished softness with fierce loyalty. They didn't comfort each other with promises that pain would fade. They comforted each other with recognition, with presence, with truth. Hours slipped by unnoticed, the world moving around them while they sat in stillness that felt like home. It was during one of those quiet moments, as Sandra watched a child chase pigeons with delighted chaos, that she felt something shift inside her, not romance like lightning, but affection like dawn, slow and luminous. She looked at Keanu, studying the way light touched his profile, the gentle patience in his expression, the peace he carried despite life's broken edges. She realized then that connection isn't always fireworks. Sometimes it's warm sunlight entering a room you forgot was dark. Keanu felt something too, though he did not name it. He simply breathed deeper, as if the air itself had softened. Over the next weeks they met many times, not because they planned a schedule, but because life began unfolding around their presence like pages turning themselves. Some days they walked through parks in long conversation that felt like therapy shared between souls. Other days they watched movies at home in silence, comfortable enough not to fill every moment with words. Keanu cooked simple meals, pasta, soup, rice with vegetables, meals that tasted like comfort rather than performance. Sandra would help cut vegetables, not because she needed to, but because she liked being beside him in a kitchen filled with quiet laughter. One evening they sat on the floor surrounded by books and half-finished tea. Rain tapped on the windows, a soft rhythmic percussion. Sandra leaned back against the couch, legs stretched out on the rug, socks mismatched. Keanu sat cross-legged beside her, flipping slowly through an old poetry book with the reverence of someone reading memories instead of pages. The room smelled of rain and paper and the gentle familiarity of presence. Sandra rested her head lightly against his arm, not accidentally this time, but consciously. Keanu paused his reading for a moment, eyes lowering slightly as if acknowledging something sacred. He didn't shift away, instead he adjusted subtly so she could settle more comfortably. Their closeness didn't require language. The rain spoke for them. The room breathed for them. Their hearts understood without needing permission. She asked him then, softly, almost without turning her head, if he ever thought two people could meet not because they needed to, but because they were finally ready for the kind of connection they once feared. Keanu closed the book slowly, placing it with care beside him. His answer wasn't dramatic, but truth rarely needs drama. I think sometimes life waits until you're strong enough to be soft again. Sandra's eyes glistened at the edges, not with sorrow but with recognition. She took a slow breath, letting his words sink into the spaces where old wounds once lived. Keanu reached for her hand, not with intensity, but like someone offering light in a dim room. Their fingers intertwined naturally, not planned, not forced, not rushed. In that moment, nothing needed to be declared aloud. Something was growing between them, quiet, patient, rooted not in fantasy but in mutual understanding. Not love announced, but love forming under everyday moments the way seeds break soil long before they bloom. They were not rushing into romance. They were learning each other, slowly, carefully, deeply, the way lasting connection is built. And somewhere between the rain outside and the warmth inside, Sandra realized she was no longer walking with broken pieces. She was beginning to heal with someone who understood how to hold them gently. The winter season arrived gently, not with harsh storms but with air that felt like memory, crisp enough to wake the soul, soft enough to wrap around old wounds without reopening them. Sandra found herself waking with a feeling she could not name, something warm and steady, like a quiet song playing beneath her heartbeat. She wasn't rushing toward anything, yet she wasn't standing still either. Instead, she felt herself moving toward something unseen but certain, like the beginning of a sunrise where darkness has not fully gone, but light is already claiming the horizon. Keanu, in his way, felt a similar shift. He had learned to live with solitude not as loneliness but as peace. Yet lately, silence wasn't just his companion. It was something he wanted to share with someone who felt safe inside it. Sandra had become that presence. Her laughter didn't break his silence, it completed it. Their meetings continued, flowing naturally like tides. Some days they met intentionally, other days simply because one reached out and the other said yes without hesitation. Nothing about it was forced. They existed in a rhythm that needed no labels, no announcements. They were simply two souls who had stopped walking alone. One evening, fog rolled over the city with the softness of breath on glass. Sandra invited Keanu to her home for dinner, the first time she initiated instead of waiting or responding. She cooked slowly, hands steady but heart alive with awareness. She moved through her kitchen not to impress him but to welcome him into her world. The table was set with minimal fuss, candles flickering, soft jazz humming like warmth in the air. When Keanu arrived, he carried a delicate bouquet of white gardenias, simple and sincere. He handed them to her without speech, and she accepted them with eyes that said more than gratitude could. Dinner wasn't fancy, grilled salmon, steamed vegetables, lemon herb rice, but it tasted like effort, like care, like something created with presence rather than perfection. Keanu complimented the meal not with grand praise but with quiet sincerity, and Sandra felt the truth in his voice more deeply than any applause she had ever received. They talked while they ate, but what mattered more were the pauses between sentences, comfortable, fluid, unbroken by discomfort. They were learning each other's silence, the way one learns a language not from grammar, but from immersion. After dinner, they sat by the window as rain began to fall, a slow, rhythmic tapping that sounded like the heartbeat of the night. The city lights blurred through droplets on the glass, turning the world outside into a watercolor dream. Sandra leaned her elbow against the armrest of the sofa, her posture relaxed, her gaze thoughtful. Keanu sat beside her, close enough to feel warmth, far enough to respect space. His presence was steady, like a candle that didn't flicker even when wind passed near. It was then that Sandra spoke about something she rarely shared, her fear of being seen too closely. She explained how life in front of cameras often meant hiding pieces of herself behind the glow of performance, how vulnerability sometimes felt like exposure instead of connection. Keanu listened with the kind of stillness that could hold someone without touching them. When she finished, he didn't respond instantly. He waited, letting her words breathe. Then, with voice low and sincere, he spoke about his own fear, not of being seen, but of being misunderstood. He had spent years carrying grief that people interpreted as distance, when in truth it was sensitivity. He didn't fear love, he feared losing it. Sandra felt her chest expand with empathy, not pity, empathy, real and grounding. She reached for his hand, slow, deliberate, honest. Their hands met quietly, fingers intertwining with no urgency. Warmth spread between them, not like fire, but like embers, steady, glowing, enduring. Keanu looked at her hand inside his, then lifted his eyes to hers. That gaze was not intense, it was gentle. It held history, present, and unspoken possibility. They talked for hours, long after dinner plates sat forgotten on the table. They shared childhood memories, small regrets, private joys. They spoke of love not as romance, but as compassion, as patience, as truth. They were not confessing feelings. They were revealing selves. At some point in the night, Sandra grew quiet, not because conversation ended, but because emotion filled her too fully to speak. Keanu didn't ask what she was thinking. He simply shifted closer, slow enough to ask permission without words, and she leaned into him more naturally than breath. Her head rested against his shoulder again, like on the plane, but this time she was awake. This time she chose it. His arm moved around her without hesitation, as though her closeness was not an interruption, but an answer to something he didn't know he needed. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of his breathing, steady, grounded. He wasn't a fantasy. He wasn't perfection. He was human, real, present, and that was more precious than anything ideal. Minutes passed like hours, hours passed like moments. They did not need to label what was forming, they only needed to feel it. When Sandra finally lifted her head, her eyes met Keanu's with clarity, no confusion, no doubt. She spoke slowly, careful but honest. Being with you doesn't feel like escape, it feels like arrival. Keanu's expression shifted subtly, a small inhale, a soft focus in his eyes, as if her words entered him like light entering a room long dimmed. He did not rush to respond. He placed his free hand gently against the side of her face, thumb brushing just once along her cheekbone. It was not a romantic gesture designed for climax. It was tender, grounding, real. His voice came quietly, steady like something he had carried inside but never voiced. You make silence feel like home. They stayed like that, two people who had spent years learning how to stand alone, now discovering what it meant to lean without falling. No kiss, no declaration, no sudden spark. Instead, something deeper, a moment where two hearts recognized each other without needing definition. A moment built not on passion, but on peace. Later, when Keanu stood to leave, Sandra walked him to the door, the scarf he once gave her still draped over her shoulders like memory. He paused before stepping into the hallway, turning back to her with a look that spoke louder than words. They didn't promise tomorrow, they didn't need to. Tomorrow already felt inevitable. And when Sandra closed the door behind him, she leaned against the wood and exhaled with slow, steady understanding. Something sacred was unfolding, not rushed, not forced, not expected. Something real, something new, something healing. Not love spoken yet, but love beginning. Time moved like soft waves in the weeks that followed, not rushing, not waiting, but carrying Keanu and Sandra gently forward into a space neither of them planned, yet both welcomed quietly. Whatever existed between them now lived in the spaces between conversations, in the warmth of shared silence, in the lingering softness of hands that found each other without thinking. They did not need to label it, nor did they seek validation from the world outside. Instead, they became two people exploring connection slowly, like walking through a gallery where every painting deserved to be studied, not glanced at, but absorbed. No one rushed. No one demanded certainty. They were discovering new ways to breathe together. One crisp afternoon, weeks into this ever-deepening presence, Sandra invited Keanu to join her on a drive beyond the city, not far, just enough that the skyline faded, and the world opened into hills and wide breathing spaces. He accepted without asking for an agenda. He trusted her rhythm now as she trusted his. The road curled through landscapes washed with early spring light, trees shaking off winter, grass pushing new green toward the sun. Sandra drove with windows cracked open, wind threading through her hair like freedom rediscovered. Keanu watched the scenery with the stillness of a man who valued observing more than describing. Neither spoke for long stretches, but silence did not divide them. It held them together like a shared blanket. They stopped beside a lake that mirrored the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where horizon ended and water began. Birds skimmed the surface like moving brushstrokes, and in the distance, mountains stood ancient and patient. Sandra stepped out first, shoes crunching against gravel, the cool breeze brushing her cheeks like memory. Keanu followed, walking beside her without needing direction. They wandered along the shoreline slowly, each step a conversation without words. Sandra picked up a small, smooth stone and rolled it between her fingers thoughtfully before tossing it into the lake. The ripple expanded outward, a circle widening and widening, mirroring exactly how she felt inside. Keanu watched the ripples, then glanced at her profile, peaceful yet contemplative. He sensed she was holding something unspoken, not afraid to tell him but unsure how to begin. He didn't pry. He simply walked closer, allowing his presence to signal that he was ready to receive whatever truth she carried. After a long breath, Sandra finally released the words building beneath her ribs. She spoke of a fear she rarely admitted, the fear of depending on someone again, the fear of allowing another human being inside her guard, the fear of tenderness becoming pain. She said it slowly, like placing fragile glass pieces on a table one by one, trusting they might not be dropped. Keanu listened without interrupting, without offering clichés disguised as comfort. When she finished, his response was quiet, thoughtful, almost like a whisper absorbed by wind before returning. He confessed his own fear, not of loving, but of loss that follows love. He admitted that connection for him was like holding water in his hands, beautiful, necessary, but always threatening to slip through. He told her he didn't want to rush anything with her, because what they were building felt too important to risk on impatience or vulnerability, turned reckless. The honesty between them created something neither could explain fully, a deeper bond woven not from perfection but from shared fragility. And fragility, when trusted, becomes strength. Sandra stepped closer then, so close that wind couldn't pass between them. She didn't lean on him this time. She stood beside him as an equal, soft, strong, open. Keanu turned toward her fully, the lake reflecting in his eyes like mirrored emotion. Their gazes held long enough to feel like seasons passing beneath skin. And in that moment, without dramatic gestures or cinematic intensity, Sandra reached for his hand again, not with uncertainty, but with something like acceptance. Their fingers intertwined with familiarity, as though this moment had been written for them long before either recognized it. They stood like that for what felt like a quiet lifetime, water rippling, birds distant, wind brushing over them like the sigh of the world finally relaxing. Then slowly, they walked together along the lake's edge, talking about dreams and terrors, childhood wishes, strange coincidences in life. Sandra shared how water always calmed her. Its movement reminded her that everything flows even when still. Keanu said he liked the mountains more because they stayed even when everything else changed. She smiled at that. She moved, he stayed. Maybe that balance was why they fit. As the sun lowered, coloring the sky in shades of gold and faded lavender, Sandra paused and sat on the wooden dock stretching into the lake. Keanu sat beside her, legs dangling just above the water. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, not intentional but inevitable. A soft chill rose off the lake, prompting Keanu to slip his jacket around her before she even asked. She looked at him as she accepted it, and something in her expression shifted, gratitude mixed with tenderness deep enough to scare and soothe simultaneously. She whispered, "Thank you," but what she meant was, "I trust you more than I expected to." Keanu nodded, but his eyes reflected something unspoken, something like, "I trust you too." They talked under a sky shifting from color to starlight, sharing pieces of themselves usually hidden from the world. Sandra admitted she had started sleeping better since he entered her life, not because he solved anything, but because she finally felt safe enough to rest. Keanu shared that he felt lighter, as though his grief had not vanished but learned to breathe without drowning him. They were not healing each other, they were healing beside each other, and that was far more powerful. When it grew dark enough that the lake turned into a black mirror filled with stars, they drove back to the city slowly, radio low, windows open, night air carrying the smell of earth and beginnings. Neither spoke much, not because silence held tension, but because silence held meaning. When they reached her home, Sandra didn't immediately step out. She turned toward him, both hands folded in her lap, breath steady, eyes bright. She thanked him not for the drive, but for the space, for the presence, for being someone she could exist beside without losing herself. Keanu didn't answer with long sentences. He simply placed his hand over hers and held it gently, like one holds something precious but not fragile. His voice came softly, a calm truth rather than a poetic line. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore." Her heart trembled not in fear but in recognition. She knew he meant it. She also knew neither of them had yet spoken of love, and that absence did not make their connection less. Instead, it made it more intentional, more grounded, more patient. This wasn't a fire that consumed instantly. It was a flame that warmed slowly, deeply, persistently. Sandra leaned across the console, and Keanu met her halfway, not with a kiss, not with intensity, but with a pressed forehead, a shared breath, a closeness that said more than physical intimacy could. They stayed like that, two foreheads touching, two hearts listening long enough for vulnerability to feel safe rather than sharp. When she finally pulled back, her eyes glimmered softly, steady and sure. And when Keanu walked away into the night, Sandra did not feel abandoned. She felt chosen. Something beautiful was no longer just beginning, it was unfolding. Slowly, deeply, real. Winter softened into early spring, and the world around them changed the way hearts do, slowly at first, then all at once, until even silence carried warmth. Sandra and Keanu now moved through life with an invisible thread connecting them, not tight, not heavy, simply present. They shared more days together than apart, though no dramatic announcement ever stated it. Their connection had grown like roots beneath soil, unseen by the world, but strong enough to hold trees upright. They were not a story loud with fireworks. They were slow light expanding through a room at dawn. One evening, Sandra invited Keanu again, but this time not for dinner, not for a walk, not for conversation about memories or dreams. This time she wanted to share something deeply personal, something she rarely revealed to anyone. She drove him to an old theater downtown, now restored but carrying decades of history in its bones. The marquee lights glowed like fireflies scattered across night. Inside, the seats were red velvet. The air smelled faintly of dust and popcorn, and shadows held stories of audiences who once sat where they now walked. Sandra had arranged for the space to be empty, just the two of them, just silence, just possibility. Keanu looked around slowly, his eyes absorbing the grandeur and intimacy of the place. Sandra spoke gently, explaining that this theater was where she first fell in love with storytelling, long before fame, long before scripts and contracts, long before people watched her through lenses and microphones. She told him she wanted to show him where her dream was born, not the polished version the world sees, but the origin, soft, raw, unshaped. Keanu listened the way he always did, fully, without distraction. He sat with her in the front row, facing the empty stage. Sandra stepped onto it, alone, standing beneath the dim golden lights. She didn't perform. She didn't act. She simply stood, breathing, present. Then she began speaking lines from a monologue she memorized at 17, words she hadn't spoken in decades. Her voice trembled not with stage fright, but with vulnerability, the kind that comes when we reveal the parts of ourselves that built us. Keanu watched, not as an actor analyzing form, but as a soul witnessing another soul open wide. She finished the monologue with eyes shining, emotions not hidden but embraced. He applauded, not loudly but with depth. Then he joined her on stage, footsteps slow, presence grounding. They faced the empty seats like two young artists again, unseen by the world, yet seen fully by each other. He spoke then, not reciting lines, but sharing words shaped directly from his heart. He told her he admired her not for fame or success, but for the courage to remain gentle in a world that often rewarded hardness. He said she carried light even when tired, even when uncertain, and that being near her reminded him that kindness can be stronger than grief. Sandra's breath shook at his honesty, not from sadness, but from being understood. She stepped closer. He didn't move away. Their hands met as naturally as day meets night, not rushed, not planned, simply inevitable. They stood in the center of an empty theater, two lives that once ran parallel, now gently converging. Sandra looked into his eyes, not searching for proof, but acknowledging what had already grown. Keanu looked back with steady warmth, as if seeing not just her face, but every version of her, the brave one, the wounded one, the dreaming one, the laughing one. No music played, no spotlight brightened, yet the room felt full. Sandra spoke first, voice soft but fearless. She told him she cared deeply, quietly, meaningfully. She did not dress it in dramatic confession. She let it sit in the air like truth, clean and real. She said being with him made her feel grounded, not lost. Safe, not sheltered. Seen, not judged. Keanu's response came slowly, like a sunrise rather than lightning. He admitted he had been afraid of wanting, afraid of losing, afraid of opening a door he once thought should remain closed. But with her, fear felt lighter. He said she taught him presence rather than expectation, peace rather than perfection. He didn't declare love like a grand speech. He let the word form softly, sincerely. He told her he loved who she was when she didn't try to be anything at all. Sandra inhaled, eyelids fluttering in quiet astonishment, because that kind of love, unforced, unpolished, unperformed, was the kind she hadn't dared believe she could hold again. She stepped into his arms and he embraced her not like a rescue but like a returning, two hearts finding home without needing keys or promises. They did not rush into passion, they rested in connection. Their foreheads touched, breaths mingling, hearts steady. The moment stretched, not intense, but infinite. They left the theater hand in hand, walking slowly into the cool night air. Streetlights cast long shadows, but neither felt small within them. The city buzzed but did not intrude. They were together in a world that finally felt quiet. They drove back to Sandra's home but sat in the parked car longer than expected, not because they feared moving forward, but because sometimes stillness is its own destination. Sandra turned toward him, hair falling slightly over her cheek, and he brushed it back gently. His fingers lingered near her skin with reverence, not urgency. She leaned into his touch, eyes half closed, trusting. When she kissed him, finally, softly, it was not the beginning of romance nor the climax of longing. It was the natural continuation of everything already spoken in silence. The kiss was slow, warm, careful, unhurried, like reading poetry aloud. Keanu's hand rested at her waist, respectful, grounded. Sandra's hand rose to his face, thumb tracing the line of his jaw. They kissed once, then once more, not claiming ownership but sharing presence. When they parted, foreheads still touching, both breathed in the same quiet exhale, like two rivers merging without violence. They did not rush inside. They savored the moment that had taken months, perhaps years, to arrive. In that parked car, under a muted sky, with no witnesses and no applause, two hearts finally chose to speak without whispering. Not a fairy tale ending. A real beginning. A beginning made of trust, not fantasy. Of gentleness, not urgency. Of two people who had walked through storms separately and found shelter not by hiding, but by standing together beneath the rain. Their journey didn't end here. It simply opened into the next horizon, wide, uncertain, beautiful. Because real connection does not finish. It continues.